Thank you so much for the opportunity here to present some of my work. I'm delighted to be in X, even if it's only online and not enjoying the sunshine from Brussels. So I'm professor at the Department of at the School of Public Health of the Free University of Brussels, École de santé Publique de l'Université Libre de Bruxelles, where I am occupying a chair in biostatistics. And here in this talk, what I really want to do is to share some of my ongoing research. The research I will present to you is the bringing together of what I think are two of my best papers, so two pieces of research that I've been doing before that I want to bring together. It's about the timing of aging. It's about housing histories and the life course. And in this presentation, I want to bring them together. So what is the influence of housing histories on the timing of aging? That's the basic idea of the talk. But to get to that point, I need to explain to you these basic elements. So what is the timing of aging? Why do I propose this as a different perspective? Housing as a life course trajectory. Usually we think of the life course as education, class, and this kind of thing. So housing as an indicator of a life course trajectory is also something different. And then bringing it together, how are housing careers, so housing trajectories, linked with the timing of aging? That's the final point, and that's the analysis I will present here. But it's under construction. So not everything that I'm saying here is totally finished. This is not yet published, this analysis, but I hope to finish the paper soon. So a different perspective on aging. This relates to the fact that while aging is a universal process, every person ages in a specific way. If we look at these four people here, they all have different ages, but their bodies seem to tell us different story. The youngest person here, 79, looks like the oldest one in the picture, while the oldest person, Yayoi Kusama, a Japanese artist, actually looks quite young. Maybe due to her dressing style, etc. So aging does not work for the same way for each person. Nevertheless, when we study aging, usually we do this on a population averaged way, looking at what is the average incidence of a disease or a functional problem over a certain age. So I propose in this new approach to aging to reconceptualize what aging is. It's not about a certain age, the cumulative, the accumulation of years since we were born. No, it's about where are we in a term of adverse transitions. And it's about when these transitions happen. So we can talk about aging early and aging late when we just think about aging as going through these transitions, most of which are adverse. So aging is a limited set. I use about 3 transitions to study aging. There's a limited set of adverse events. The timing of this event, so when exactly they happen, at which age they happen, is variable. It's not the same. But also their impact is not the same for everyone. If you have a functional health problem at age 60, that has a very different impact than at age 80, both on our mental health and our well-being, and how we feel about aging in general. So, and what determines the impact of these events, according to me, is the life course as well as the institutional context. So the life course is what happened before in our lives. Institutional context, with that, I mean the kind of policies that have an influence on our daily life, which might be workplace policies, health policies, and so on. So this is a bit, I mean, the broader scope of my work, my current work. In a first step, I wanted to focus on these transitions. If we study these transitions, what are we doing? We're looking at age as a variation, as a flow, and not a stop. And which transitions did I isolate? We can think of these transitions as the rite de passage of aging. One important transition is to go from being partnered and social to being widowed or isolated. So these are kind of societal conceptions. These are maybe not individual. We do not have to agree with these things, but this is how society views aging. The second important transition is to go from being an able person in the third age to a disabled person who needs assistance in the fourth age. And a third one that sometimes we forget, although I think not in France, there's some attention lately on this, is on financial well-being in later life. It used to be that aging also meant that you go from being a productive member of society to someone who's dependent and maybe poor. So these are three important transitions that we need to study if we consider aging is a transition and not a gradual change over time. How do we study that? Well, we use event history analysis and survival analysis, which is a technique that is used to investigate if and when an event happens. So it's analysis of the duration of non-occurrence of an event during the risk period. Of course, mostly we study aging with panel data, longitudinal data, so we have to restructure these data so that age in years is the metric of time instead of chronological time. I'm going to spend just a second on this data restructuring because this is an important step. So just to show you, the panel format on the left is how the data are collected. We have the different wave to 2006, 2008, 2010 that we see in the columns. In the lines, we see different respondents who have a different age at the first observation, as is the case in many panel studies. The star shows an event that happens. So the event that we're interested in can happen either during the observation period, before or after, which relate to censoring, a key part of survival analysis. So, and then we restructure this panel format to a survival format. The survival format is only interested in a couple of things. It's the age of first observation, the age of last observation, and last observation might be when the event happens. So then in the third column, we say, does the event happen, yes or no? Or in case the event already happened, a person is not at risk. Theoretically, what does this mean? It means that we go from a growth model, a gradual change over age, that is very good to explain fixed covariates, to a survival model, which assumes that there's this transition that happens during this period that changes everything. It's not a gradual change, it's just like a shock, an important moment. And the emphasis in the survival model is not on these fixed covariates, but it's on what determines the timing of change. And it works a bit better to study all types of covariates. So I've done this I've done both of these things. In the first paper, we can see that we use the panel in a growth model on the left. On the right, it's the same data, but we use it in a survival model. We see that we have a similar shape. This is reassuring. It means that over age, we see that both the average score, here we're looking at the example of the change in ADL, so that the number of ADLs over age increases in the graph on the left. On the right, we see that the risk to have a health loss when it hasn't happened yet also increases over age. But this is a kind of litmus test to see if this model kind of tells us what we expect us to do. This was like a kind of proof of concept paper that they did. The data source in both of these studies was the English longitudinal study of aging, which is part of a global family of studies on aging. It has lots of useful information. It's freely accessible through the UK data service, even if you are not working in the UK, but you're interested in longitudinal data. It includes nurse data, biomarkers, all different types of information, which might be interesting if you want to do your own study. But one interesting, important aspect is this project Gateway to Global Aging Data, because ELSA is part of a global family. So in Europe, we tend to use SHARE, for example. But with this Gateway project, there's code available to integrate the main information in all the different countries and waves. So that you have a comparable data set. So this analysis uses wave 3 to 8, which is a time span over 10 years. Why? Because in the wave 3, there's something specific called a life history questionnaire. I'll come back to that in a second. Just some results from this proof of concept paper on these three transitions. So we see that there's three transitions we study: health loss, which is the onset of limitations and activities of daily living; bereavement, which is the loss of partner; and wealth loss, which is the entry into the lowest quintile of non-housing wealth. We see that both health loss and bereavement kind of act in the way we would expect them to do if they're good indicators of aging, in the sense that they increase monotonically over age. So they are higher for higher age ranges. In terms of how often they occur, if we look at the x-axis, we can see there's a big difference. So health loss is a lot more common than bereavement. Bereavement is really focused in the older age ranges, and it is relatively rare in this survey. While health loss is quite common, we can see this in the median survival times, which is 74 for health loss, while we never reached the median survival time in bereavement, so the 60% at 94. Wealth loss, on the other hand, has a very different profile over age. We see two humps. There's not a monotonic increase. So there's two periods where there's a bit higher hazard, higher risk of wealth loss occurring, which is just after 60 and just after 80. This means that there might be other factors influencing wealth loss. We can think about the labor market. It's really difficult if you lose your job to get re-employed just before retirement, at the age between 60 and 65. So this might be an explanation for this first peak of wealth loss quite early in later life. But okay, that was this proof of concept paper, which basically talks about aging as an increase of chances to experience these adverse events, and the chance to experience them early or late is linked to social factors. I investigate multiple social factors such as income, wealth, class, socio-economic, ethnic background, and gender in this paper. And they were all linked in the way you would expect them to. So the second part of my talk is about housing trajectories over the life course. Why would we want to study housing trajectories? So I argumented in a paper that housing histories are really important to think about later life, because they make it possible to study different principles of life course epidemiology. They allow us to study the effects of timing, duration, and order. Timing means that the moment you buy a house is important. In the UK, because housing is actually very linked to policy. It's very linked to the economy. It's probably the most expensive thing most people will buy in their life. So it's very linked up with how the economy is doing at the moment that you buy your house. So timing is important for thinking about housing. A second thing is duration. Housing is also linked to health. The quality of the place you live has an influence on your health. I think it was one of the first studies of social epidemiology. Engels looked at the housing circumstance of the British working class and said that these are definitely one of the reasons why working class people live less long in the beginning of the industrial age. And the last thing is order. If we think about, do you first rent a house and then buy it? Or do you first buy it and then rent it? This is a question of order in your housing trajectory, so it kind of reflects social mobility. I used to work I used to be a professor, lecturer in Liverpool, and the small house on the left was around the corner to me. It's the house where one of the Beatles grew up, so a very small working class house. But then he went on to live in this really big mansion on the right. So while if you would just think, he lived in this small rented house, you would not adequately understand the risks he has in terms of health loss and wealth loss in Italy. Things can change. So that's the idea of social mobility. So Ringo grew up there, but in the end, he was able to buy a house of his own, and this really changed his propensity to become ill early and later life. If we think about housing as a career, so this is, for example, my housing career. I grew up in the house on the upper left. Then we moved to a similar house. I went to study and I rented a lot of time. I moved abroad to come back to Belgium. So if we kind of think about this in a methodological, quantitative way, we need to classify these transitions. We need to classify this career. So we can say, okay, my parents rented the house, so part of my life. So from when I was when I was born till age 11, my parents afterwards bought a house. So I grew up in own housing from 12 to 18. And then I lived in rented housing for a long time. I lived abroad for a while, and I came back to Brussels to rent. So this type of analysis, where we kind of have a longitudinal categorical sequence, makes it possible to think about housing careers. This is, for example, my housing sequence using this analytical technique would look like this. So for each year, we mark a letter that shows us a category. There's a certain number of categories possible, and we can look at the sequence and the order, the duration, the timing of transitions in this sequence. So what we need to do sequence analysis is this categorical time series, which is an ordered list of elements where elements consist of a certain state, usually categorical, such as here housing situation, and they're ordered by a certain structure, here age. So I've already dropped the word sequence analysis. What is that? Well, it's a toolbox. It's not a specific method. It's a toolbox to analyze sequence data. There's some graphical tools in there. There's some numerically descriptive tool, but there's also some analytical techniques to compare and group sequences, which is what we're going to focus on here. I've written a bit about this sequence and how we can use it using life history data in the reference that you see there. So how do we study this housing career? Here I'm going to make use of this retrospective life history data that I already showed, which were gathered in ELSA Wave 3, but they're also gathered in SHARE. How does it work? So they asked the respondent to map out different domains of his life over time. There's anchoring events, like, for example, do you remember where you were when the moon landing happened in this case? Or often everyone remembers when the children were born, who they were living with at that time, etc. So they kind of reconstruct, using very important life events, a person's life history. From this life history data, we can construct this categorical time series and analyze it. So here, for example, I just looked at the housing domain, and I distinguished 8 different categories, as you see, which are marked by the different colors. So here I show the proportion for each age group in these different categories. We see, for example, that most people at the age of 0 were born in a house where the parents rented, in the dark red. There was a smaller proportion, a bit more than 25%, almost 30%, which grew up in a house that was owned by their parents. There was a small group that, in the sample here that I'm using, which is the ELSA sample, that grew up abroad, and then there's some other category. The most marked thing we can deduct from this graph is the enormous change that happens around age 20 to 25, which is a transition from parental to own housing. We can see that all the forms of parental housing, so parents own and parents rented, parents abroad, parents other, really diminish. And by age 30, almost 90% or more of the sample is living on its own, which is very normal. But this allows us to kind of study social mobility. So what if we compare the house where you grew up, if it was owned or rented or abroad, with what happened afterwards? Because here we are just seeing the state distribution, we're just seeing the proportion by age. But what if we are going to reconstruct these trajectories for people over time, over age? And then, of course, we want to group these trajectories so that we can kind of make some groups that make sense. For example, if we have here 3 housing sequence, in the first one, we just look at 4 years here, and we see, for example, in the first sequence, someone has been renting for 2 years and then owning for 2 years. In the second sequence, someone was abroad, then was renting, then owning for 2 years. In the third sequence, someone was renting for 2 years, went abroad for a year, and then bought a house, owned a house. So how similar or dissimilar are these sequences? That's an area that has been debated a lot. What's the best way to kind of compare sequences? What we do is we kind of set costs to substitute one sequence into another. There's different rules that we can set, different algorithms that we can use to do that. But that's maybe for people who are a bit more interested. The most used ones are Hamming or optimal matching. So I did that for this general sample. I tried to make groups, and I'm going to represent the different groups using the Cron graph so that you can kind of characterize them better. So the largest groups in the sample were these two. On the right, in blue, we see people who grew up in owned housing and then bought a house. So that's about 29% of the sample who of English people, I should remind you. So 29% almost never rented, maybe a short period as a student, but most of them have always lived in own housing. The other group are the ones who've always lived in rented housing. So their parents rented and they rented. That's about 16% of the sample, so also a large chunk. Then there are some people who grew up in rented housing, but were able to buy their own house, a very large group. So there's a large group of a large segment of the population actually managed to climb the housing ladder during their life. I should remind you, this generation was what we call the lucky generation in terms of social institutions that were built around them. They had the best of the welfare state. They were able to, in the UK, a lot of people were able to buy houses from the government at reduced prices. So we really see that there's a huge chunk of people who were able to buy their own house in this period. Some of them did early. So I've named the groups according to this trajectory. So parental, rental, then owning is pro. Then we have people here who rented for a while on themselves before they bought a house. So they bought a bit later. They grew up in rented housing, rented a house for a while, and then went on to own their own house. Also a large group. Then there's a special group that grew up abroad and most of them rented for a short while and bought a house by age 15. There's a group that somehow has always lived in the parental rental housing. And there's a group, a very interesting group, I have to say, that grew up in own housing, but then went on to rent. So either they are still living in the parental owned housing, or they went on to rent themselves. So they never managed to gather the capital or get the loan to buy an own house. So this could be considered as downward social mobility. So we have these two contrasting groups here, or two important contrasting groups. The POR group of 5%, right in the middle, who grew up in owned housing, grew up with, let's say, wealthy parents, but were not able to secure their own house. And those who grew up in rented housing, so the PRO and the PRRO groups, which is a large part of the sample, who were upwardly mobile, who grew up in rented housing, but were able eventually to buy their own house. Okay, so how can we bring these things together now? I've been talking to you about aging, timing of aging, housing careers. So now I want to bring those two things together. I want to see how these housing careers are linked with the timing of aging. So that's the main research question I want to answer. Are there any differences in the timing of specific aging transitions between different housing trajectories? And is it more the end or the beginning of a trajectory that defines the influence of social position? If it's the beginning of a trajectory that defines influence of social position, we can talk about the long arm of background, the long arm of parental housing, parental tenure. If it's more the end, we can say there's more of a individual kind of influence on the timing of this aging transitions. I've just focused here on health and wealth transitions because bereavement is too rare to study in this sample. It happens really in the last 5 to 10 years of life for most couples. So it's a different story altogether. So what are my hypotheses in this study? I want to kind of show that lifelong renting can increase the risk of earlier health and wealth loss. That's my working hypothesis. That's what we would expect. Now, worse life circumstances in terms of housing will mean earlier or higher risk of health and wealth loss in later life. But also that upward mobility, such as the transition of renting to ownership, decrease risk, but downward mobility, so this blue group of parental owning to renting, that it actually increases the risk. We also suppose that lifelong house owners have the lowest risk. How are we going to do this practically? So I'm going to bring together several things I've been talking about. On the one hand, we're going to have just usual demographic controls, but I'm going to have this housing typology as a categorical covariate. This housing typology was, deduced by sequence analysis in a Cox proportional hazard survival model using this panel data. So going straight into the results, what can we see? So the hazard ratio from Cox proportional hazards, just looking at the time for a second, yeah, I'm good. So I want to show here, we're kind of controlling. So these are the risks, the hazards that we have versus a baseline risk. So it's very important to know what's the baseline in this kind of graph. So the reference category here is the group of which the parents own the house and then they bought an own house. So it's the people who've lived all their life in own housing. It's the wealthiest people who are born. I've chosen somewhere a cohort in the middle, who are male and who are white. So we have around 6,000 cases here. If we look at their risk for health loss, we see that, in line with my hypothesis, the highest risk for early health loss is those who rented their entire lives, either living at their parents' house or renting themselves, but their entire lives. But we see that there's another group who has an increased risk of health loss. And that's the POR group, so the group that grew up in own housing and then went on renting, so was never able to buy their own house. So it's this group that actually we could say it is some form of downward mobility. We see that those who were upwardly mobile actually don't have a different health risk from people who lived in own house in their own life. There is, if you buy later, there seems to be a slight effect, just significant, a slightly higher hazard of having an early health loss. If we look at wealth loss, we see a different picture. So there's different types of housing trajectories that are conducive to early and higher risk of health loss. Again, of course, we see that people who rented their own life have the highest risk of wealth loss. That's to be expected. Because buying a house in the end is a financial transaction. But we also see that people whose parents grew up abroad have a higher risk of wealth loss, which is notable. It shows that maybe there's some kind of buffer function of parental wealth that is not available to them. Interestingly, the group of downward social mobility, so whose parents owned the house and then went on to renting, has no significantly different risk of wealth loss from people who owned a house themselves all their lives, or either to their parents or themselves. So there seems to be a buffer function, some kind of compensation from parental background on wealth loss. And what can we say about the upwardly mobile people? So people who are upwardly mobile have, those who've bought early don't have a significant difference in their hazard rate, those who buy late a little bit. Okay, so what are the findings of this study? Renting in midlife is associated with a higher risk for early onset of functional limitations. Longer early life renting and growing up abroad are associated with high risk for later life poverty. So that's That's kind of confirming that it could be both the early part of life and the later life that has an effect, depending on which outcome we're looking at. So there is a protective compensatory advantage of growing up in owned housing for wealth, but not for health. Social risers, so people who grew up in rented homes but were managed to buy their own house, barely different. They're very different in terms of health from lifelong owners, but they have a bit higher risk of later life poverty. So there's some limitations, of course, to this study. We're looking here at an analysis of the English population over 50. So we have to think about the specific societal context and the period. As I said, there were some policies under Thatcher in the 80s that made entry into the housing market quite easy. People could buy their council house at quite low prices, which is very good individually for these people, but it means that the housing stock really diminished in the UK. One important question is, how does this affect current generations? So this is a study of a certain generation. Of course, now the housing crisis has kind of become a hot topic everywhere. But it's very difficult to generalize from this study to what would happen to current generations and affordable housing and renting longer. What my study seems to suggest is that it's not good. It's that these effects can carry over generations. If people are renting now and they have children in rented homes, there will be increased risks for early health loss or poverty for the next generation. And we should also maybe say that buying a house is not the only model to live. So buying a house is a typical thing to do in your 20s in the UK. In other countries like Germany or Switzerland, this is not the case, and renting, both the quality of rental housing and the guarantees that you have as a renter are very different from the UK. So buying a house is not the only model to kind of think about social status. Some conclusions. Aging as timing of transitions emphasizes this variability inherent to aging. So why did I actually depart on this path of studying transitions? It's because there's so much heterogeneity in aging that it's very difficult to study individual risk factors and will change over time. So housing trajectories mark a social position over the life course in a nuanced way, as I show. So it gives us a bit more than just the current status or just the class of origin. It shows that there's a trajectory, and we can study both timing, accumulation, and change over time in the order. And the rhythm of aging is influenced by this intergenerational social trajectory, with parental housing being linked with later life poverty risk, and own housing in midlife being more linked to health. Okay, I think that's it. If you have any questions, I would be very glad to answer them. And you can always also email me afterwards if you want more information about any of the things I've mentioned. Thank you.